because we do have so many people in the room and we want to make sure that we're able to get to as many people's questions as possible, we ask that you limit yourself to a maximum of 2 minutes. 2 minutes is a long time. I do ask that you ask a question if you go up. Obviously, there's a lot of strong opinions about this, but if you have a question so that we can benefit the rest of the audience by providing more information on this topic. So with that.
So what about the questions that were pre-submitted?
We're actually going to start with one of those. Molly was going to start with one of the pre-submitted questions, and we'll try and interweave those throughout. And if for whatever reason we don't get to all of those, we'll make sure to respond to people directly. Molly, would you like to start with one of the pre-submitted questions?
Absolutely. So, can you guys hear me? No?
It's very hollow.
Great. All right. We'll find someone to fix that.
We can share. You're going to have to come closer because it's.
We'll try to get that fixed. Okay, so this question comes from Earl from Richmond Heights. It's a three-part question. One is, why are the fire districts not being combined in a manner similar to the police? The second question is, how close are you to getting the signatures for this to be a ballot proposal? And the third question is, please explain the process for establishing 33 new districts.
Okay. So I'll try and take those in order. Number one, about fire protection and why the fire districts are not being combined. We looked for pretty extensively at fire protection in the region to understand what might make sense. And in fact, we spent a year for our initial fire study meeting with folks in the fire protection community, both on the management side and on the labor side, to understand what an ideal fire department for the region looked like, because there was frankly a bit of interest from them. And at the end of the day, what we found was that given the current landscape of fire protection, particularly the cost difference across the region, that it was not going to be tenable to go from where we are today to a single fire department in one foul swoop. It would be $1 billion fire department, essentially. And so one of the lessons we learned as we continue to think about how does this look and how do we address this issue that we know is part of the landscape here, is thinking about what lessons we could learn from other places that had gone down this path before. And one of the things that we saw as we looked to both Indianapolis and Nashville and other regions who have done their own consolidations was that it tended to be an iterative process. So most people who have any familiarity with Indianapolis know that they have what they call UniGov. It's one unified regional government there. But what we learned is that locally, they actually referred to UniGov and then UniGov 2.0, where they continued to consolidate services like policing and fire on a smaller scale. And we think that fire protection is actually a really ripe area for further consolidation, but I think it needs to happen on a more localized basis given the cost factors, because it wouldn't be responsible from a financial standpoint to citizens to go to a single department at this phase. The second question you asked,
How close are you to getting the signatures?
signature collection. So I want to be clear that I work for Better Together, which is a 501c3. The campaign that is will be working on this effort is called Unite STL, but they're the ones who submitted the language to the Secretary of State's office and initiated that petition process. But they have not collected signatures, and they probably won't start collecting signatures until the winter. There's a litigation period that is coming up. There's a sort of statutory link to each phase of that process, and they want to get through the litigation period before those signatures begin collecting. So no signatures have been collected to date. Lastly was about, I think it was something that I already answered.
Explain the process for the 33 new districts.
Process for the 33 member districts. So similar to, this actually was modeled off of Clean Missouri in some ways. The mayor and the county executive heads of the transition would select a group or a individual, nonpartisan, or a group of individuals to draw initial lines. They would have to follow, obviously, the Voting Rights Act of 1975, and they would have to do the typical things that are legally required, like respecting current political boundaries. So if there's a way to ensure that you're not cutting a municipality in half that currently exists, that's something that they will do, while also trying to make the districts approximately equal in size from a population standpoint. Those districts would then be submitted to both the Board of Aldermen and the County Council for approval. And then those folks would be elected in the final districts in November of 2022. So we'll go to the folks in the line.
Okay. I have an initial question just now for what you said when you were saying that you wanted to make the 33 districts equal in size. Are you talking acreage, or are you talking population or what?
Population. Population.
Okay, thank you.
And
then-
just for context, the population size of those would be approximately just under 40,000 per district, so similar in size to just a little larger than a state house district.
So what you're saying is that you'll break up some districts, or some municipalities, but it looks like some parts of those municipalities may go to another municipality.
That's correct. There are a few municipalities that are larger than that, but where it's possible, they're going to avoid. That's just sort of what is legally required.
So I think I understood that you said this whole process started, that you were part of this whole process, which started in 2013?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and then when we learned about it earlier this year, the indication was this has been going on for 2 years, since 2015, or 17, or approximately thereabouts. So who all started this in 2013? Who all was involved in 2013? And who chose the people who came and became more of the process in the last 2 years?
Okay, so there's a few questions there, and I'll try and get to them as quickly and as efficiently as possible. First, our organization started in 2013, in November 2013, and it was formed by a group of folks who had an interest in seeing the city and the county come together in some way, shape, or form. Burt Walker, Ambassador Burt Walker, was our first lead donor who gave $100,000 to our website, and you can see a full list of our board of directors on our website, bettertogetherstl.com, but most of those have been the same board members since our inception. We began our process by trying to have what we call community-based studies, so not just collecting the data on what the cost was from the municipalities and things like that, data that didn't exist, which is why they formed our organization, because there was no central place you could go to get a basic lay of the land, to understand what we have in this region. And we began that process, it was myself, my colleague Dave Leipoltz, and our executive director Nancy Rice at the time, and we worked with experts in each area of our studies that I mentioned before, trying to understand, and then we formed committees of people who worked in those areas as well. So for public health, we had public health practitioners. In our economic development study, we had folks on the private and public side as the chairs of that committee, and then we held different listening sessions for each of those study areas. At the end of our studies, our initial round of studies, that's when we formed the task force that you're referring to that began in 2017. And those folks were chosen based on their experience and as St. Louisans and what the perspective that they could bring to the table to help make sure that the staff had an outsider's perspective on trying to think about different ways to address these issues.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to piggyback a little bit upon the lady before me. I'm just kind of curious as to why community residents were not a part of the initial task force. What type of notification did the communities get to allow them to be a part of this task force?
So the first thing I'll say is that the community residents were part of the task force. But in each of our studies, before the task force and during the task force process, there were public meetings we've held over the last several years prior to the release of these recommendations, 34 town halls. We had 1,200 online surveys just for the task force process, that year and a half piece. We attended over 475 community meetings prior to the beginning of our work this year. And so we tried to involve the community in all ways. We were diverse geographically and representative. And over the course of our work, we spoke to over 13,000 people, not including online engagement. So there were different phases where people were included in this process.
And lastly, there's nothing said about the school districts, merging the school districts.
Right. So when we began our work was focused on municipal level governance, and school districts are separate political subdivisions. So while there is a Clayton School District, it is not the same government body or same legal entity as the city of Clayton, and similar for all the other school districts. We thought long and hard and talked about, at the task force level in particular, about education, because it was not a part of their initial mandate, but they were hearing from folks, not unlike yourself, who were asking, well, what about education? How does this fit into this puzzle? And the reality is there was a strong recognition that education has to play a factor in bringing this whole region forward. But that was not a part of something that they felt that they could take on, given the time constraints. They didn't have the expertise from our organization to do that. And really, when they looked at the historical record, particularly recently, they looked to see like what had organizations like the Ferguson Commission done to guide that work. And what they found during their process was that there was really not even in their process firm founding to offer solid recommendations. So the task force felt that they didn't have, they called for, in fact, one of their signature priorities was calling for an education task force of its own, because it required so much work and so much dedication that we didn't feel our organization was prepared for, and the task force didn't feel that they were prepared to take on. So there are two ways that I think that these recommendations do positively impact schools, however. Number one is, when we look at the way tax incentives are used right now, particularly TIF and other tax abatements, oftentimes those incentives and those tools are overused because we have this system where we're competing against each other. By making those tools and those decisions about when those tools are used done at a regional level and removing the incentive of sales tax from the local perspective, we'll begin to see monies flow back into school districts in a positive way. The other thing is we recognize, and there's tons of literature out there supporting this locally, in fact, that the success of students in the classroom is very heavily influenced by things that happen outside the classroom. And we know that right now we are not doing a good job of delivering on those things, at least from a governmental perspective. Certainly not in the city of St. Louis. Earlier this year, they released a report called an Equities Indicator Report, looking at just that question: how well are we doing delivering services that affect the child well-being outside of the classroom? And they scored 25.75 on a scale of 100. So we know that we can do a better job locally, but we have to have the resources to be able to do it, and the will from a regional perspective, so that it's not isolated to one part of the region trying to pull themselves up by bootstraps that they don't have versus the other part.
So case in point, will a task force be established soon to deal with education?
I've talked to folks in the education space, and they are very interested in doing that. They're trying to figure out what that looks like from their organizational capacity. It won't be something Better Together does. Thank you. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry, I apologize for the first two ladies. If you, as you're coming up, can you please just introduce yourself so I know who's
Sure.
in the room? Thank you.
So my name's Dave Gulick. I live here in Clayton. I'm a transplant, not native. Started in Creve Coeur, went to St. Louis City, downtown in Benton Park, and then shifted to U City and then into Clayton. Consistently across all of those hops, it's been because of the quality of government services, and as I get older and more family focused, the educational system. So as you can imagine, I get a little bit nervous when I see that we're going to blend services from the regions that I've left, because the quality of support is not very good. And I land in a neighborhood where I think it's very good. I'm not an accountant and I'm not an economist, but I struggle to believe that if we blend everything across the board, the highs have to balance the lows. Because everything I read and all the data and the literature is very optimistic and very rosy. Seems a little bit too rosy. I'd like to understand a little bit about the negative implications for the communities like Clayton that have above bar services to offset the communities that have below bar services, because I'm not seeing anything about revenue increases anywhere else. I'm talking about some people are going to save money, but it doesn't add up, and I'm not able to find any hardcore data on your website, and I've read everything, so I feel like I'm at a loss here. So help me understand the negative impacts for the communities like Clayton to subsidize the lower communities.
Right. So obviously the goal would be to raise the level of service in the places that currently are not getting adequate levels of service to a level that is more adequate for those places.
Right.
While continuing to allow for high service levels in places like Clayton that you appreciate.
Makes sense.
One of the things that is on our website, and maybe you looked at this and maybe this is what you're looking for, is an analysis just based on current spending levels and current revenues of what the shakeout would be by municipality based on the revenues that they receive and the expenditures and services that will continue to be within those districts. And most of the cities, I think 65 of them actually end up with, I don't want to call it surplus, but a surplus based on the revenues that they will continue to receive under the system and the services that they will have to continue to provide at the municipal level based on the current cost. So for some communities, if they so chose to, could take that extra money, or for other communities where that is not the case, they could choose to raise their local property tax to have contract for a higher level of service from the metro city government, if that's something that the residents there decided they wanted to do.
Right, but I guess if I boil it down to brass tacks, the goal is through the efficiencies that we gain in the centralized government, we increase the amount of pooled money that can be distributed back to the 33 entities.
Correct. To a certain extent. That's to cover the basic level of service. If they wanted something above and beyond their municipal level services, they would have to figure out a way to increase taxes at a local level to pay for that.
Right, so the way I interpret that, and we don't have to get too deep in the weeds because we have a line here.
Yes.
If Clayton is already above the standard baseline of services, that distributed pool of money will not be allocated to Clayton because they're already at or above that line. This is the kind of data that I'm struggling to find. And I can take this offline. If there's somebody that can point me to the financial metrics that I can dig into, because I'm a numbers guy,
Okay.
I can spin it myself and answer my question. I just think that the Better Together as a whole is a little too optimistic.
Sure. Well, let me say on that front that one of the things that I think that I want to be clear about is not we will save X number of dollars over 10 years, but it is that given what we know services to cost today, and based on multiple conversations with county budget directors, city budget directors, and other folks who have professional expertise in this area, what services probably reasonably could cost to deliver an adequate level of service, there is the potential for savings in the system for vast amount of savings. So our first goal in those financial projections was to ensure that whatever this new government was solvent. And then beyond that, there's a possibility for savings based on efficiencies to be found, and also the ending of the trend of increased spending or increased revenues at the rate that we've seen in the last several years. I'd be happy to talk to you, or have Jack is actually raising his hand. He's actually
Yeah, the data is the key thing. So
yes,
give me the
understood.
data.
I understand.
Yeah. So the reason where that's rooted from is I see like DePere says this is a negative for us, and Chesterfield's talking about succession. And I'm actually a little irritated that Clayton's government hasn't come up with a position on this, but that tells me that there's data out there and I'm just either a moron and I can't find it, or it's selectively distributed, which is a problem.
Understood.
So
So
it absolutely could be the first one.
Excuse me, I don't mean to be rude, but could you have him come up and help explain, because that's the question I have, and plenty other people have, that we don't have to step around.
Yeah, we've been in line though, so.
That he's asking, where is the information? Why is that not a basic answer you can give him?
Well, I did mention, and I was going to reiterate that particular financial analysis I just talked about is on our website. If you go to bettertogetherstl.com, I think it's, from a general perspective, I can speak generally, but I can't speak to anyone specific without looking at the data to be able to tell you what the situation is.
But if you take,
I know, I see,
but if he take him out there, I would have to go out there and hear that question, but I wanna hear all the other questions as well.
understood.
That's all I'm just saying.
I appreciate that. Yes, sir.
Yes, Ward Klein, long-term resident of Clayton. 2 questions, kind of a follow-up to the previous questioner. Your materials do promise or indicate 4.9 billion in savings right here that everyone was handed.
I believe it says up to.
Well, up to, but the 4.9 billion, my question is, Secretary of State who has to approve your ballot language on your first 2 revisions, I know the 3rd revision is being looked at now, indicated savings or cost unknown. So can you reconcile for me between what the Secretary of State is saying about the ballot language and what your materials are?
Sure. The state auditor is the office that actually produces that
I'm sorry, state
potential
auditor,
fiscal
you're
note. But the statement, I believe, said savings were unknown, but up to $1 billion annually. And when you look deeper into the financial projection that 4.9 comes from, it's cumulative over the course of that 10 years.
Actually, what I've heard is it's unknown, period.
Well, I would encourage you to go back and check it
Okay,
out,
I
because that's
will.
not what it says.
Actually, my real question, and I know it's short, is regarding your process. If 1.3 million citizens of the St. Louis City County vote against this in November of 2020, but Greater Missouri, 6 million vote for it, would you consider that a success?
No.
Ben, okay,
So-
thank you
so-
for the answer. Why
But-
not,
well,
why
kind
not,
of-
why not let the citizens of St. Louis City and County vote on this, understanding a constitutional amendment is required to operate it, but why not let the citizens vote on it that are affected?
So
Representation thing that seemed to start this country?
I'd encourage you, if you have comments, to get in line like the other folks in line. So there's two things. One, my answer was no, but that is part of why we are working very hard and will be dedicating tremendous resources to ensuring that their success locally. That is the legal path. The constitutional amendment is the legal path forward. You're asking why not have a subsequent vote with only the city and the county.
Yeah. Even a non-binding referendum, get the vote of the people before you lock this into our Constitution.
Sure.
Why not take that path is my question.
Yeah, so we've looked at that and we've talked about it, and there's two reasons, both related. One is a little more legal, and the other is just from a policy standpoint. One, the policy piece is that I think the proposition that you're offering presumes that the system is benign in some ways, and for many of the residents that live in St. Louis City and County, this is having a very detrimental effect on their lives. They've lost jobs because of the practices in some of the places in this region. They've lost housing, families have been torn apart, and so there's an urgency to this that I think your proposition belies a little bit. The other piece of that is, from a legal perspective, you're making the argument that the city and the county have some outsized say, or should have some outsized say in this constitutional matter, and because presumably they're deriving their authority from the Constitution. And the reality is there are 15 different charter cities in St. Louis County that could also make that argument. So we could potentially not be looking at two separate votes, but up to 17 or more based on this. And I think that is problematic.
A lot of words. I think you need to put it to the people of city and county first. Let them say, if it's a great idea and all these savings are there, put it to the people, the 1.3 million people affected. Let them say.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Michael. I'm born and raised in Ballin, Maplewood resident now. And I'd like you to clarify that transition 2-year. Let's say that the voters approve this measure and we do merge. What is that 2-year transition, and what that, in terms of the county executive and the mayor being in charge of how these different agencies are going to come together? Is this something that we don't know, and so when we vote, we just have a leap of faith that this is going to work? Or if everything falls apart in those negotiations and no one can make matters come to be with something that we would all want to make it successful, what then?
So during that 2-year transition period, the mayor and the county executive lead that transition effort. There are a number of things that have to happen according to the language during that period, one of which is, again, the appointment of a police chief to begin bringing together the police departments from an operational standpoint, the appointment of a nonpartisan expert to draw the lines, and then the departments figuring out how to bring them together. One of the first things they have to do as a part of their process is actually determine a tie-breaking process. So their primary function is actually to come up with what is called a reorganization plan. So a plan of how these departments will come together, whether that be the Recorder of Deeds office or any of these other departments that are coming together under this new government. And if they are unable to come to a consensus agreement, it doesn't change until the new government takes over and the new leadership that's elected has a say. But ultimately, the reorganization plan for the executive, and this is just for the executive and administrative functions. So they're not deciding how the county council or the Metro Council is going to operate and all those things. Those decisions have to be left to the elected officials when they come on board to that Metro Council. But that ultimately their reorganization plan that they're developing over that 2 years is supposed to have public comment periods as at certain points in that process, and then has to be approved by the Metro Council. If it's not approved by, there's a 2/3 majority threshold to strike down that executive plan, but that's the process that's laid out.
So after the 2020 ballot measure, then the citizens themselves won't have any more say in terms of approving any of the subsequent measures that are the details, the nitty-gritty of the merger?
No, I think that there's two voices. One is the public comment period that's necessitated in their process, but then also they will be electing the Metro Council that has the ultimate authority to overturn that the
So
proposed
through
plan.
representation.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Mark Todorovich, and I'll say that I've lived in my entire life in this area, and I've never lived in the city of St. Louis. But if anyone has ever asked me where I live, every time I've said St. Louis. And if they try to pin me down to what suburb, I'll say close to some. I used to live near Sunset Country Club, or now I live near the Galleria. But I've always refused to acknowledge that I live with one of these small burgs that no one else in the world, if they didn't live close enough to, knew what it was. And I was always upset when Judge Meredith did the DSEG program, that it was a wonderful opportunity to force a merger in the city of St. Louis and have us and the county and have us face the issues that deal with our area and why we have been behind all these years, why we're not a southern city and we still have way too much racism, why we have schools that get money and can't deal with it. And I think you guys have done this almost as bad as you could. You know, it's like I feel that Rex Singfeld is doing this to us, and that it's all in secrecy, and I hope he wins. And that I think it's absolutely awful that the rest of the state is judging on ourselves. But I'm not sure that we can market to ourselves and get people with an open enough mind to have the right result. So if I was at one of these meetings a couple weeks ago, and I think that it's highly likely that the city and the county of St. Louis are going to be within 1.5 points as a total of which way it goes, and I can't guess which way it goes. I think you guys, if you really get your marketing together, and I'm not even sure which way it might be, I think if you market to enough of the state that we're going to screw over the people in St. Louis and St. Louis County, that it'll win, because they think. So if you market against it, because we have such a rural versus urban psychosis in this state, and so and you need to really work on marketing. You need to be inclusive. I think it's a terrible mistake that we have the mayor and whoever the new county supervisor is going to be making these decisions. You know, you probably need to go either just one more person or 3 more people to have this transition. And if there are 22 charter cities
15,
in the county,
Yeah.
and they have professional full-time mayors that are on a paid basis, 1 or 3 of them should be on it, or maybe 2 of them and 1 North City leader. I mean, you think the quietness of this, and I understand you're reacting, you're trying not to get it too much, but by not being inclusive, you are not getting the people involved. It's very much a situation where if most people feel like if you're doing it to me, I'm being abused. If we're doing it, we're doing the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will just say I respect and thank you for sharing your comments. I respect that perspective. I will just say that nothing about what we've tried to do has been quiet. When we launched our initial organization in 2013, we had a press conference with the mayor, then mayor and county executive. When we did town halls that were public and published in local publications. When we launched the task force process, we had the new mayor and county executive as a part of that process. And so I apologize if that word never reached some of the folks in this room, but we've certainly not been trying to do anything behind closed doors. So, yes, ma'am.
I'm Ann. I've lived in St. Louis County my whole life. I live in Richmond Heights currently. I guess a couple questions I have is that you haven't addressed. One thing that, you know, I think St. Louis prides itself on is the individuality of the different communities. And I don't think anybody wants to live in unincorporated St. Louis County. And is that what it's going to look like? Because that's what it sounds like. And is there any way to keep those individualities in those communities and building codes and things like that that are enforced in certain communities so they look like they do? How are we going to preserve those type of things?
So it is not going to be unincorporated St. Louis County. Obviously, there is still going to be an unincorporated part of this metro city. And a third of the people in St. Louis County today live in unincorporated areas. Many of whom do like their service.
No, and I'm not trying to put them down. I'm just
to your point. You know, there's still these municipal districts will still exist, and will be able to function in providing perspective on certain things. Zoning and planning is one of them, where they will be able to make recommendations for their area to the metro city for a decision. And so they'll be the board of adjustments for their locality. There are ways that local influence will still play a role. The ordinances of the current ordinances of the governments will become the ordinances of the metro city. During that 2-year transition period, the county councilor is then charged with reviewing all of those ordinances for conflicts and making recommendations for how to resolve any conflicts, but otherwise they continue on and will be enforced by the metro city and the way they are today, unless the metro council at some point in the future does something different. So I don't think things are going to be changing overnight in the way that it may feel right now, but
My next question is on the underfunded police pension that's in the city. How is that, what are the plans to absorb that and in what way?
So there is no plan to absorb it in any way. One of the features of this new structure is that in the ways that these municipal districts will exist as taxing sub-districts of the metro city, there will also be the creation of what is called the municipal corporation in what is currently the city of St. Louis. So all of the outstanding obligations financially will remain with that municipal corporation, and the obligation to pay for them will come from revenues generated within that territory, the current territory of the city of St. Louis. And that includes those unfunded pension liabilities.
Thank you.
Yes.
A little on the shorter side here. Is it this one? Or
No, you have the right one.
I have the right one.
It's just,
My name is Nancy. I have also lived in St. Louis County all my life. I think I have a couple of questions, but I think what stands out the most to a number of us is that there has been a large lack of transparency in the way that this whole plan came about. The fact that 2013 you had all these public meetings and what have you, I mean, I'm willing to hear out here, but I haven't heard anyone say they knew anything about it until this current year. What also concerns me is you said that one question has to do with where does the Stanger piece go in this? Because what I understood, because this is not the first meeting I've been to, and I have read the material online, and I know there's been changes, and I haven't gotten a chance to read all the changes. But who will write the new charter? What I've heard at previous meetings is that it's Cruson and Stanger or whoever is the person. The way this was originally written, Stanger would be the one, along with Cruson, to write that new charter. So that's not transparent because we don't know what a new charter is going to look like.
so
Go ahead.
you may have heard that from someone else at one of the previous meetings, but it's a misconception. That was never a part of the plan. charter for the new government will be, the initial charter will be the charter of St. Louis County as it is today, with obviously the different elected officials setting up for the legislative body. And then from there, as I was speaking to earlier with the gentleman who asked the question, the reorganization plan is what the county executive and the mayor will be in charge of, which is only looking at executive and administrative functions and how to reorganize those. So it's not a wholesale rewrite of the charter, is
Well,
essentially what I'm saying.
So you're saying that St. Louis County, that the Metro City will take the current charter that's in existence for St. Louis County? Is that what you're saying?
As a framework, yes, ma'am.
Okay, framework is a pretty loose
Well, that's, I mean,
term.
so the only reason I didn't just outright say yes is the obvious change there is that the St. Louis County Council is 7 people.
I understand. And then we have 33
correct,
people on
correct.
this.
So that part is different, but the other pieces are the same.
You did actually answer the question about Stanger. Where is the piece on that? Because I understood that there was some of a divorcing from Stanger that occurred between Better Together and you guys.
Well,
I mean,
you attended a previous meeting, so you know that
More than
obviously, okay, well, obviously there was a lot of consternation. People, the reality is what we went into the initial version of the recommendations wanting to do was provide a level of stability so having elected officials from the current system transition over for the first 2 years of the new government. What we heard loud and clear from folks is that they would prefer to have that election sooner rather than later. So that election now takes place in November of 2022 for the Metro Mayor, Prosecutor, and Assessor, whereas before it was in November of 2024.
Okay.
I'll allow you
what is
one less,
those?
and then I want to get to the rest of the folks in line here.
Two. I guess the other part becomes, how is that money going to be divvied up to the municipalities? I know that was brought up before, but it's very fuzzy, and no one has been able to give us a sense of, and that question the gentleman asked about Clayton versus a smaller, I'll say it, a smaller North County municipality. How much they're going to get versus in order to have what they have, or a little bit better than what they have. And then if you're telling me that Clayton will get the same amount of money that the other guys do, and so Clayton is going to have to raise taxes in some way in order to keep the current obligations,
No. So the
services in place.
The way that it works is there will be, currently we have a mix of obviously various different taxes that go towards the city and the county government. A mix of property taxes. Most municipalities, but not all, have a local property tax as well that goes to their municipality. Sales tax dollars through the sales tax pool, excuse me. And utility taxes, charges for service, different things like that. So the way that it will work is for the new government, that still would work where municipal districts would continue to receive their local property taxes because the residents in that jurisdiction paid for those taxes. They would still continue to receive utility taxes, which for many municipalities is a pretty significant source of their revenue stream. They would continue to receive sales tax dollars that are dedicated to specific debts that they have, outstanding debts that they have, or that are for services that are provided at the municipal district level. For example, many places have a parks tax, so they would continue to receive revenue on those things. Other sales tax, general revenue sales tax, would go to the Metro City, but they would still be able to charge fees for service for things that are happening in their community, and that's where their revenue mix is found. And there is a little bit of a breakdown, again, with some estimates based on current spending and current revenues for each municipality available on our website that sort of gives you a picture of what that could look like. I want to also clarify that for cities where that mix of things that sort of automatically go back to the municipal districts, where that is not on the plus side automatically, they will be able to submit a budget to the Metro Council for saying this is our level of services that we provide, municipal level services, municipal district services. this is our revenue stream and this is the gap, and the Metro Council has to return enough money that's generated from within the boundaries of that territory to be able to cover their expenses, because at the end of the day, they still have municipal services that they are delivering to their residents.
That and pensions from a lot of the municipal police departments.
Right, so that would be represented as an outstanding obligation, and they would be covered through whatever taxes exist, or if necessary, sales tax generated within their boundaries. Thank you. I'm going to say, before I have the next speaker go, given the number of speakers we have in line and the amount of time, I'm going to go ahead and pause the line, so that if you're in line right now, we'll answer your questions, but please don't get in line. But I'll make sure that we have a mechanism to get any other questions that exist outside of these folks as well. Yes, ma'am. Hi, Ellen.
My name is Ellen Mosseri. I'm a lifelong resident, or have been on and off, of St. Louis. I taught for 25 years at John Burroughs, and then I left to go and become the head of school in Miami-Dade County, which is a unigovernment system. My sister lives in Indianapolis, which is also a unigovernment system. I was gone from St. Louis for 20 years. The summer I came back, Ferguson happened. My friends all called me and they said, "What in the hell are you doing, moving back to a place like that? What are the values of that place? They're not yours." And I think we are not cognizant, because I live in Clayton. It's a wonderful cocoon, terrific. I mean, I don't have to step out of Clayton, and I can just have a dandy life. But if St. Louis doesn't do something about the inherent racism in this city, it doesn't really have a future. The world is moving very, very quickly. We have a very fast-moving world, and we're either going to keep up and get beyond it. Maybe you haven't heard this particular proposal, but this has been talked about for the past 45 years. If you remember Gene McNary, I'm with him in class at LLI. He's an old guy. I'm an old person. We're together. We're old. We remember when this was talked about over and over and over. That's St. Louis to a nutshell. They always talk about it. They just never do anything about it. The economic future of this city is not in, I hate to disabuse you of this, it's not in the county. It's on Forest Park Boulevard. It's Washington U, it's at the other end St. Louis University, and it's Cortex. That's where the revenue comes. So, and for those of you who want a plebiscite, I give you Brexit. Think about it. So I just have one little quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
But think about this differently. We've got to approach this differently, or we don't have a future. Our city is the core of our tree. And if it's dead, all of us little county branches will die too. So let's think of it that way. But I am concerned about Mr. Singlefeld. Is that how he?
I don't know where, Singfeld.
Okay. I mean, it's a little teeny thing here. I read where the state legislature is trying to roll back Clean Missouri. Is Singlefeld for rolling it back or not?
I honestly don't know. I don't speak on that.
Okay.
I honestly have no idea. Sorry, I didn't move away because I wanted to get away from Ellen. I quite like her. I'm trying to reduce this feedback.
Hi, my name is Steve. First, I want to thank you for coming out here and letting us all voice our opinions. We appreciate it. In your brochure, you talk about resolving debts, and that the debts of St. Louis City and any of the municipalities will be funded from their own revenue. What happens if they default on their debt? Does that fall back to this new structure that's being created, or how is that going to be resolved? Because some of the debt is significant.
Yeah, so I'll say two things. First, let me answer your question directly. And under this new structure, they would all become taxing subdistricts of the Metro City. So if any entity were to default on this, that same process would happen as it would today. So like the St. Louis City, for instance, would be a municipal corporation, so they would then have to go through whatever legal proceedings that looked like. The Metro City would have the ability through the Metro Council if they chose to go to access other revenues to avoid that, but that would not be something that happened automatically. I will say though, the financial picture, that same principle obviously applies to any of the other municipal districts. The financial picture in the city of St. Louis is not a rosy one. I won't pretend that that's the case. But it's actually far from the place of bankruptcy that I think many of us believe it to be. It's not nowhere near the levels of debt or financial unsustainability as places like Detroit, as some have alluded. So I don't think there's a really high risk of that, but that is what would happen.
Okay, and just one other thing, maybe to reiterate what I've heard, a projected up to 4.9 billion in savings basically sounds like it's coming out of police and the court system, because a cooperative voice doesn't produce savings. A streamlined process is debatable in government, and I've heard more than one 10-year or 12-year projection that never comes true. So I think you need to do yourself a favor and put a lot more financial data and examples of how this is going to work on your website and elsewhere.
Sure. So let me just say briefly again that it would be impossible for us as an organization to say we will save $10 on this, let alone 4.9 billion, because ultimately those decisions are made by the elected officials of this new government. They're the ones that have to make those decisions on an annual basis. But our projections are based on what we think are reasonable expectations of savings. Actually, not so much in police, some in municipal courts and other areas, but there's a lot of inefficiencies in our system that exists today. One example is the city of St. Louis in some departments actually does payroll by hand. So there are numerous examples of things like that there are opportunities for savings within the system, and they could add up to be as much as that compared to what our current spending trajectory is. But your point is well taken. Just thanks. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thanks. My name is Becky Patel. I've lived in the St. Louis city, and I currently live in Clayton. And I certainly enjoy the very high level of services we get here that folks have alluded to. But I also do believe that we can do better in our region. My concern is about how we do that, right? So like the folks who collect my trash come and get it from the back of my house. I don't have to pull it out, right? So that's like an example of the really high level of service I have in Clayton that I'd be willing to sacrifice if it led to greater equity and services for everyone in our region. I don't know that inefficiencies are really what's holding St. Louis back as much as inequities. And what I'm trying to understand is how consolidating into one police department means that we have a more equitable, better serving its people police department. Like, how does that follow? And if you can explain how, like, I think the Clayton Police Department is CALIA certified and, you know, has certain requirements in terms of certifications and credentials that, you know, and so how, when you consolidate, what are going to be the requirements there, and how is that going to reduce the inequity that is really the root of the problem in our region and Ferguson and all the things that lead to that?
So you raise an excellent point in the fact that there are places that do have high quality level services and policing, as I mentioned, but oftentimes we know that the places that are not receiving adequate levels of policing, places where folks are making, police officers are making $12 and $13 an hour because they have been dismissed or let go from another department or two other departments, and this is the best job they can find. Those places are also where our poorest residents live, where there's a higher concentration of African American folks in this region. Policing specifically, one of the things we also know is based on research from people like the Police Executive Research Forum and others, there's ways we can bring more equity to that system outside of a single consolidation, but they're voluntary. And oftentimes the communities that most need those kinds of reforms don't have the resources to do that. We have probably about the right number of police in this region, but the reality is places in this region, there are some places where they're oversaturated in policing. and other places where we're not getting it. And more to the point, we're operating in a model where, from a structural standpoint, it's a specific police department's job to keep crime out of their community. But it's not anyone's job to say, what are we doing about this issue on a region-wide basis, and how are we keeping people safe on a region-wide basis? And so changing the way that we are considering looking at these issues is a really important factor. Being able to share data in a way that is not currently done today will help us to be able to address crime in a way that is more modern, so that if someone commits a crime in Clayton, I don't want to use Clayton as an example actually because I don't know what their specific relationship with shared data is, but there are many communities out there that don't share their data with St. Louis County Police, for example. So they may have committed a crime last week in South County, and so we're not able to address that, and oftentimes the people who end up on the shortest end of that stick are our most vulnerable populations. There's also a recognition in not just policing, but in every area of government that what the recommendations that are being offered is a framework for a new government that allows us to get at some of these issues. It is not a policy, and there has to be a really serious and deep policy conversation about what does good police policy look like, what does good housing policy look like under this new government. And I would say stay tuned for that, because we're excited to be able to engage the public in that conversation as well.
So just to follow up on that, does that discussion of what does this consolidated police department look like, does that happen before November 2020 or after?
Before. I think we would like to be in a position where the folks, when elected officials go into thinking about what do these departments coming together look like, and then when we're electing the first folks for this new government, they have clear understandings and clear mandates from the public about what they should be doing to enact good policy into that new government. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jamie. I've lived in both St. Louis and in Kansas City, downtown and in the greater metropolitan areas, and I've been teaching in Ferguson, Florissant for 20 years. So my question is about these cities, St. Louis and Kansas City, that started out as small rivertown cities with outlying municipalities that developed over 100 years. Those metropolitan areas grew up around those towns. They weren't pre-organized in a dysfunctional fashion. So now St. Louis is a large metropolitan area that started as a city, and our population has grown around small towns that have existed for 100 years. In Kansas City, when I lived there, the downtown area was suffering. There was nothing going on. It's now been 20 years. It's alive. It's safe to live there. It's safe to work there. And economically, it's been boosted over the last 15 to 20 years. So my question is, what research has been done about how the Kansas City Council of Governments, the Kansas City Metro Planning Council, and the regional councils there were able to create this economic boost without dismantling their municipalities?
So I think part of what you described is a really great point, because it points to a very specific history of St. Louis and our inability from the city's standpoint to annex further territories in the way that most other regions have over time. And I mean, that mostly dates back to the Great Divorce when the city and the county separated in 1876, but that was one tool that was traditionally used to ensure that they could continue to grow. Not obviously, they haven't annexed their whole areas, but Kansas City, from a geographic standpoint, is a sprawling area. They also don't have nearly the number of outlying municipalities. So I believe Jackson County, I think there are 19 municipalities in Jackson County outside of Kansas City. Obviously, there are other counties in that mix as well, and then there's the Kansas side. But we haven't done the specific studies you're asking about, but I think there are lessons to be learned, and we did look at their model of governance to understand what are the things that might be replicated locally from there. Ultimately, for one of the things was, for example, at-large seats as part of their city council, but we decided that was probably not best because it tended to favor folks with greater resources participating in the system versus others. But I think the point that I would say is part of why Kansas City was able to revitalize its downtown and invest the resources in its downtown, because even with those other places, they were by far the biggest piece of the puzzle, and they were able to do it in a way where everyone in Kansas City said, this is a priority for us and this is how we want to operate. St. Louis, we don't have that ability. Even having St. Louis City being a completely separate county, we're not even tied to St. Louis County in the way that they are there.
So are you saying that municipal governments are not capable of cooperating and coming to agreements between police departments to share information?
No,
between
I'm
city governments to support a regional economic practice?
No, I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying that the scale of our fragmentation is on such a different level that it has made problems that existed in other areas of this country and that other regions have faced as challenges, particularly their urban cores, it has exacerbated those problems and made it doubly difficult to try and address them.
Because we are choosing as a region not to cooperate, why would we reorganize as opposed to use regional councils for that? I'm looking at places like Kansas City, like let's say we change the Missouri Constitution. Then is it going to become a good idea to regionally govern in Southwest Missouri and to annex small towns with Springfield, or to regionally govern in Columbia and annex small towns within an 8,000 square mile area? Because that's what we're talking about with St. Louis, as opposed to creating a cooperative and interactive local government system.
I think the issues that those communities face are very distinct, and the things that they're trying to accomplish are very distinct, and so it's not really an apples to apples comparison. But to your point, I think there are examples of small scale cooperation on a lot of different things in St. Louis. We know in the Normandy School District there's a 24/1 collaborative where the mayors there have tried to collaborate and work closer together. We know there's a park collaborative with Richmond Heights, Brentwood, and Maplewood, where they all share parks and recreation services to a certain extent. There are examples on a small basis of these things working and being successful, and so my premise would be that you would presumably, if we see success in that, want to double down on that success, but also recognize that those small efforts to achieve success have not fundamentally changed the outcomes for the region from the perspective of spending, from the perspective of population loss, and from the perspective of trying to change how we have this conversation about how people in this region interact.
My last question is somebody who chooses to live in a small town is representation.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, myself and many other people in smaller towns within the St. Louis metro area are represented by anywhere between, 1 and 7 council members. Okay? That means that for every elected official in my town, they're representing 4,000 to 5,000 people. Okay? Ferguson, Florissant, Kirkwood, Webster, we can go down a long list. If there's a new metro government, each elected official is going to represent 40,000 people. And it makes me question, where is my access to government and representation?
I think that's in part a fair concern. I also think that if we step back and look beyond St. Louis and look to other places that have similar models for their areas, that people have connections to their government and that they have the ability to access their elected officials. One of the things that we full-throatedly recommend as part of this is that we change how we have staff accompany those elected officials, because we recognize right now it's not working in some places. So it is our recommendation that this Metro Council seriously consider having at least 2 full-time staff people for each of those areas. One to focus on policy, another one to help with constituent services. I think there's also a reality that many of us have pretty decent access to our state representative as well. And so there's, I think, a reasonable expectation that you would still have access to those elected officials under this new government.
The math doesn't work.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Ben Centuria from St. Louis County, and I agree with the woman who spoke earlier that this is perhaps the critical issue of our time in terms of a merger, in terms of working together. We've tried to raise this in the past. It hasn't succeeded. It's absolutely critical, which means it has to be done right. And at this point, from my sense of talking to people, is that there's a sense that you're doing this to us, not with us. And I really think it's important that it be done in such a way that we not come out of this divided. So a number of years ago, Forest Park was being considered for totally being rehabbed by the city of St. Louis. What they did is they gathered information, as you obviously did very well. They then held charrettes, and they asked people, what do you think about these various scenarios that we're thinking about? They got feedback. You all obviously did a lot of research. Then a small number of people went in a room, same with you, came out with a proposal, same as you did. The difference is what they did is they then held a series of formal workshops where they said, here's the proposal, we're breaking it down, we want to know what you think. What's working here, what's not working? What should we keep, what should we throw out? And as a result of that, they came away with a plan in the city of St. Louis that had broad public support. It was really terrific. And we need you all to do that for us. Not do it to us, but do it with us. So I have a request, and I don't know if you're willing to take this back to your board. It seems to me there are two possibilities to pull from this, a real democratic, involved, we feel like it's with us proposal. One is Mr. Klein's suggestion, that there be some kind of a non-binding vote in city and county to see what people think. Number two is step back and use a Forest Park kind of proposal, kind of approach. Take your plan, forget the initiative for now, ask people what they think. I mean, you've really created a debate. You've done a very big service so far. And ask people for their response. Have a debate that really allows us to change your plan. And if you do that, then I think you'll do a great service and we'll come away united. Otherwise, I worry that we're going to lose the opportunity, we're going to be divided, and the result, regardless of the vote, is not going to be a healthy one.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Gary Fader. I'm an attorney and a resident of Clayton, and my concern really echoes the comments about access and what I think is the demise of local government as we've known it in this community, the entire community. I'm a real estate lawyer. I deal with development and zoning, and I know at a local level those are usually the issues that get the most attention from local government, and the comment about people wanting to have government that's responsive. State statutes basically say that local land use and zoning is to be done by a two-step process. You have a planning and zoning commission made up of local people. They hold a public hearing. People can come and make their opinions known about a particular project. After that happens, it then goes to a board of aldermen or city council, who then also have a public hearing and hear from the community, people who live near a particular project. And at the end of the day, the decision is made what to do by the board of aldermen and the city council, those people who are elected by the people who live in that area. It's my understanding that if your proposal goes forward, the so-called cities, which will obviously just be emasculated districts with no power, that system will have the planning and zoning commissions that are authorized in every other community in the state. They will go away in St. Louis County. There won't be any planning and zoning commissions anymore. All of the decisions, and I again put decisions in quotes, will be made by a board of aldermen or city council who actually won't make a decision. They will simply be entitled to make a recommendation. That recommendation will then, if your proposal passes, be sent down to City Hall, where these 33 people, who at best represent, given the numbers, perhaps in the local community, 1 out of 33 people will actually have an interest in the local project. Those people will make the decision about zoning and land use. So it seems to me this is totally contrary to any notion of local government. I agree with everyone who said that what we have doesn't work, but what you're proposing, in my opinion, this is a cure that is far worse than the problem, and this is going to be a disaster and the end of Clayton after 100 years, the end of University City, of Brentwood, of every other community in this. They are all going to go away in the name of this Better Together. So I'd like to know how you respond to that.
Sure. So I think one of the things that was important for the task force process is understanding how to get a good balance of that local perspective that you talked about and appreciating so much. And it was zoning and planning infrastructure that reflected some other parts of our history, both locally and nationally, that are not so positive. The clear reality is that those zoning and planning tools have a long history of being misused as well to help keep certain populations out of certain parts of this region. And so it's important that, from our perspective, that is the priority in ensuring that there's a regional perspective on making good decisions, policy decisions, versus an effort to exclude certain populations or do things. That should be something that is prioritized in this conversation as well. And so having those boards of aldermen serve as that planning commission and having a strong recommendation to that Metro Council is what we found to be a good balance between those two.
Let me just respond to say, I teach a class at the law school. One of the things we talk about is that zoning in the history of St. Louis has been used to exclude. There's no doubt about that. But to use that as a justification for essentially taking all local government and consolidating it in a single body is not a justification for it. You're right, exclusionary zoning is a problem. It needs to be dealt with, but this is not the way to deal with it. This is truly throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay, thanks. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm David Berland. I also live in Clayton. I really want to thank you for coming and answering these questions, as was said earlier. And thank you for bringing this issue forward again. I've gotten a great big kick out of the evening. The passion has been wonderful. People care and they're here. And I think that speaks to some of what Ben Centuria was saying earlier, involvement. And I'm glad to see that there's involvement. And there's involvement 18 months before this might go to the polls, something like that. That's some time. You have Better Together has changed what got filed in Jefferson City at least twice. So that means that there is a way to make changes here. How? How do we change? How do we unite the city and change Better Together along some of the lines that have been raised tonight? There has to be a mechanism because there have been changes already.
So I want to be clear, just again from my own perspective, that Unite STL is the one that changed things.
Okay, so how do we get the United STL to make the change?
I have to give my legal disclaimer for my own purposes.
Right, okay, I understand.
But Unite STL, so the last change they did, I think it was a month ago, I can't remember. But from my understanding is that they are up now against pretty challenging and difficult deadlines for being able to collect the amount of signatures to get anything on the ballot as it is with that last change. And so I don't know what another change looks like. I don't know that it's feasible for them to be able to still have success in this. That's been my understanding, but I will take your question and see if I can get some further clarification.
Good luck. The other point is that the November 2020 is an arbitrary deadline. There's no reason that it couldn't be November 2022 or November 2024. No reason at all. I may not see it if it's delayed, but I've enjoyed my life in Clayton, and thank you. So the point is that there are changes. There are changes that were made as recently as this year. And how can we make some more? We have to bring the region together. There are details in Better Together that are not acceptable, that are not going to pass. We all know that. But we got to bring the region together. Let's do that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
How you doing? My name is Rob Allen. Baldwin, Chesterfield, and now I'm unincorporated St. Louis County. So I've been listening to everything in the news and seeing everything. My big question is, based on you guys have compared it to Nashville, Indianapolis, we heard Kansas City just a little bit ago. Nashville and Indianapolis were 60 years ago. We're 25 years out from Kansas City. How are we going to guarantee success, or what are you thinking?
So one of the things we did in looking at those other regions, looking at Nashville, Indianapolis, Louisville, Jacksonville, other places that have gone down a similar path, is to understand the things that they did well and honestly some of the things they didn't do well. And in particular, we tried to ensure that there were more opportunities for minority representation under this new government than was a priority for 1960 Nashville or 1970 Indianapolis. And so there are some ways that those things have gone into consideration. Actually, the number of representatives given our population is probably, there's a lower population to representative ratio than some of those other places have offered given the greater population we have here. And so we tried to learn some lessons there as well. We looked at things like partisan versus nonpartisan elections and what that would mean, because there's no Republican or Democrat way to fix a pothole, but the reality is that the academic literature looks at the way that we understand who participates in those systems of nonpartisan elections really is not, it has a diminishing effect on African American turnout. We looked at figuring out when elections should be held and many other things, lessons that we tried to incorporate in this proposal and combine with public feedback so that we could have the highest chance of success if this goes through.
All right, and I don't know if I missed the answer, but on the debt that you're carrying over, like the municipalities in St. Louis County, you'd mentioned that nobody right now is going to go, broke and they're not going to be able to pay the debt. But how are they going to get that money if they don't have it moving in? Because in reading your stuff, you've got looks like you've still got some local taxes. How is that going to be handled?
So if there is a revenue source that is specific, like if there's a sales tax, let me actually go more general. Those municipal districts will still have their local property taxes, fees for service, utility taxes, all those things available to them. If they have a specific sales tax that is tied to debt obligation, they would still continue to receive that revenue. If they don't, and all their other revenue sources still don't add up to cover their outstanding obligations, both from the debt side and the delivery of municipal district services, then they would be able to get additional revenue from the Metro City to make sure they're able to meet their obligations. Thank you.
I'm the mayor.
Yes, ma'am. Hi, Mayor.
I just want to make an announcement.
Sure.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I realize not everyone is from Clayton, but I did want to let you all know that we are going to Clayton, and the Clayton Chamber of Commerce and probably a couple of other sponsors are going to host another forum. It will be on May 29th right here at 6. It'll go from 6 to 8, and we're going to try very hard not to limit the numbers of people that can come in. And we'll have a variety of panelists here for questions.
Thank you. Okay, so what's next from our perspective? First of all, let me just say thank you for taking the time to come out and be a part of this conversation and being civil with me. We want to invite you, if you continue to have questions, if you have questions tonight, we have some organizers in the room who will be sticking around for a little bit. There's Larry in the back, Jack's over here on my left, your right, and then Will's up front, and a couple folks outside who would be happy to talk to you. After you leave here tonight, you think of another question, you're on your way home, and I should have asked that, we encourage you to visit our website, bettertogetherstl.com, and there's a page on there, /ask, where you can submit a question and we'll get back to you on there, and oftentimes actually we'll publish the answer to that question on our frequently asked questions page, because we want to make, if you've had the question, chances are somebody else has a similar question. I want to encourage you all to continue to participate in this conversation. Obviously, there's a lot of passion around this topic and a lot of strong feelings, but I think one of the things that we mostly agree on in this room is that if we do nothing, we're going to continue to see the same results in this region that we've seen for the last 30 plus years. And I know that that's unacceptable to many of you in this room. So thank you again for participating in this conversation, and have a great evening.